Welcome everybody. My name's Mark Cosgrove and I'm the cinema curator here at Watershed. And thank you very much for coming. This is part of, as it says up there, the Conversations About Cinema strand that we're running, which is a partnership with Bristol University. And we invite academics whose discipline it might not or might be to come and introduce a film that they've got an interest in, and then to have an informal discussion afterwards. And as you can see, the theme is that we've been running with for the past few months is the impact of conflict. And I'm sure, as many of you know, that it's the commemoration of, well, firstly, the commemoration of the centenary of the start of World War I, but it's also this year the commemoration of the 70 years from the Holocaust, and this very week the anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, when the kind of full horrors, as it were, the full extent was becoming apparent of what was happening in World War II. And so now, delighted to welcome Tom Beaumont, who's going to say 10 minutes introduction to The Decent One, which he saw yesterday. And he is a fellow in modern European history at Bristol University. Delighted to welcome Tom.
Thanks very much, Mike. So, even when judged against the other leaders within the National Socialist state, the Third Reich, Himmler stands out. He stands out as, I think, a particularly loathsome character. He was not even particularly popular at the time amongst the leading Nazis. He didn't have the backslapping bonhomie of, for example, Hermann Goering. He didn't have any of that charismatic magnetism which was so much a part of Hitler's appeal to the German people. He wasn't the ideal, the idol of National Socialist manhood as, for example, Reinhard Heydrich was. He was never the subject of a personality cult. He also wasn't particularly liked. People didn't like the way, for example, he inveigled himself into people's private lives. It wasn't particularly considered, it wasn't something that people enjoyed at all. And yet he was absolutely central to the way the Third Reich state ran. He was at the centre of the SS empire. He was, along with Heydrich, one of the architects of the final solution, the working to fulfill the will of Adolf Hitler, and the executor, the executor of Hitler's orders to bring what became the final solution about. His story is so much the story of the Third Reich and of Nazism. The film we're about to see, the documentary, is based on Himmler's private papers, which came to light in the last decade. It was taken up by the documentary maker, and the documentary was first shown at the Berlin Film Festival in 2014, and perhaps in the questions we might talk about reception and so forth. So, based on the private diaries of Himmler, his papers, his letters, and so forth. Now, these aren't entirely new. For example, Peter Longerich, whose brilliant biography of Himmler, which came out in German in 2008 and was published in English in 2012, and which is kind of my standard text for what I'm saying today, actually. Much of the material we're going to hear in the documentary today appears in Longerich's biography. Indeed, Himmler's diaries and so forth are one of the key standard sources for historians understanding the interior workings of the Third Reich, along with the diaries of Joseph Goebbels, which are also in the news today, as people may have seen. Having said that, though, there is stuff here which is new, I think. Particularly, I found, when I was watching it yesterday, absolutely fascinating to see Himmler's side of the correspondence in the 1930s between him and his wife. Really interesting insights there, which, as to the best of my knowledge, aren't in the Longerich biography. So, this is a documentary which invites us into the interior world of Heinrich Himmler. Not a very comfortable place to be. And I think it invites us to think and to ask really interesting questions about, well, what is this doing? Is it humanizing a monster? Is it humanizing something which shouldn't be humanized? There's a really interesting question there, I think. And it's a controversy, this question about how should we think about the Nazis, which ever since the Third Reich was in existence, people have been asking these questions. At Nuremberg, for example, at the war crimes trials, the Nazis were portrayed very much as the other, very much as this sort of demonic force which had led Germany back into barbarism, a sort of atavistic, by which I mean backward-looking, barbarous force, very much not like us, people who'd departed from civilized modernity, if you like. That changed over time, this sort of representation of Nazism and the Nazis, particularly the Nazi leadership. And a big moment, people when it's quite famous, was the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And this seemed to portray the Nazism in a different light, not demonic, not monsters, or indeed, if monstrous in Hannah Arendt's phrase, in their banality. Eichmann seemed terrifyingly normal. Sort of bureaucrats, an accountant almost. While I was watching this, I was thinking about the film that came out a while ago now. I haven't got the exact date in my head, but The Downfall, a very famous film of Hitler's last days in the bunker. Very different to what we're going to see today. This is very much a documentary, that is sort of a feature film. But again, it's asking us, what are these people like? Portraying them as humans. Raising, again, difficult questions, I think. Particularly, I suppose, the big question is, well, are we supposed to empathise with them? Because the picture we get here of Himmler is Himmler the family man. Himmler's relationships are very much at the centre of this documentary. Himmler's relationship with his parents first, then his wife, and particularly his daughter. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, what does that mean? Should we be empathising with someone responsible for mass murder, the planning and the execution of it? Well, I think a historian called Robert Gerwarth offers us a really interesting way of thinking about this, I think. Robert Gerwarth, who wrote a biography of Reinhard Heydrich, really good biography called Hitler's Hangman, in which he talks about cold empathy. That when we go into the minds of these people, we go in a critical, detached fashion. And he talks about letting these people talk for themselves. He says in their language, their actions, and their behaviour, they reveal themselves. And I think there's something in that. I think there is. I think that what we see when we, if you like, scratch the surface of a Nazi, we find out that actually underneath it all, well, they're a Nazi. And I think that is a really fascinating way of looking at this, that we can go in, but we go in with detachment. We go in not to empathise necessarily, but to understand. So, I suppose leading on from this is the question, which is, what can the private life of Heinrich Himmler tell us about bigger questions? What does it tell us about the Nazi state? What does it tell us about the Holocaust? Well, I think it's, with a figure like Himmler, I think the private life is actually really significant. And it's significant because the private life informs the public persona, and the public persona in a state like the Nazi state, with a figure like Heinrich Himmler, it then shapes the role that he creates for himself, it filters out into the broader world, if you like, of the SS, of the concentration camp system. What do I mean by this? Well, Himmler saw himself as a soldier all the time, and this comes across in the documentary. His image of himself was as someone who was a martial figure and someone who was, right from the start, so, well, in the post-war period, in 1918, he joins the German army in 1917, but from the post-war period onwards, right through to 1945, someone who is waging a war, an unremitting, merciless war against Germany's enemies. He has difficulties as a young man and throughout his life with social relationships, social interactions. And the figure of the soldier then becomes, if you like, a way of navigating these difficulties. Decency, the film's called The Decent One. Decency becomes a really significant, plays a really significant role in Himmler's thinking. He has this idealized view of the soldier, of martial valor, martial way of thinking. And that is about cold, self-control, calculation, keeping himself reserved back is a sort of defense mechanism. But it begins to inform his whole way of thinking, and you can see it through here. He's very much thinking in these terms. And this then feeds into his way of creating the SS, that the image of the SS man which he champions, slightly absurdly, if you think of him as the kind of figure he is, very unathletic, very not the kind of Nordic Aryan ideal, and yet he pushes that ideal. But the image of the SS figure which he pushes is one in which people control their emotions. People are able to, as I say, keep control of themselves, even when faced with something like mass murder. So the private life really playing a significant role in the public persona, in turn playing a really significant role in the way, in this case, the SS functions. Okay, so I think as we're going through and watching the documentary, there are some interesting questions to consider. I've raised some of them, but some others, and things that I don't know the answers to yet, certainly not from my first viewing. This gives a very particular view of National Socialism. It's obviously from the point of view of Himmler and his family. Well, what does that tell us about Nazism more broadly? What does it tell us about the Third Reich more broadly? What's the relationship between German people and Himmler, Hitler, etc.? Where's Hitler in this? Himmler was always known as the loyal Himmler. He was sort of so loyal to Adolf Hitler that he'd said at one point, if Hitler ordered me to kill my mother, I would. And yet Hitler, he's there, but to me feels like he's in the background slightly. I wonder what does that mean? So those are a couple of questions there. I want to finish off by just talking about Himmler's daughter. I haven't written her name down. I think it's Gudrun. And obviously the relationships are so much a part of this film. But the one that really interested me when I was watching it was that relationship between Himmler and his daughter. And I was fascinated by Himmler's daughter. And it seemed to me to just raise, again, another really interesting question, which is about living with the legacy of this. How does someone like the daughter of Heinrich Himmler live with that? And there's a broader question there, I think, for all of us, which is, how do we then live with the legacy of National Socialism? Okay, thanks very much. I'll